السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. لعل أوبي ايغبونا الابن ورث الاسم والنضال الأسطوري عن أبيه الراحل أوبي ايغبونا الروائي والكاتب المسرحي والناشط السياسي النيجيري المولد، الذي اشتهر بقيادته رابطة الشعوب الملونة العالمية وبعضويته في حركة الفهد الأسود البريطانية، تلك المنظمة التي حاربت من أجل حقوق السود والملونين في المملكة المتحدة. أوبي الابن هو أيضا ناشط لعموم أفريقيا وكاتب مسرحي تاريخي للأطفال، حيث كتب وأنتج مسرحية يوم التحرير الأفريقي للأطفال، ودرس التاريخ الأفريقي لمدة 31 عاما. هو عضو مؤسس في تجمع عموم أفريقيا للمناصرة والعمل، قام بتنظيم فصول من حركة الشباب الطالبية الأفريقية في سان لويس ميزوري وسياتل واشنطن وشارلوتسفيل فيرجينيا وشيكاغو إلينوي، وطور شراكة مع الاتحاد الوطني لطلبة إريتريا عام 2000. عمل مع ممثلين عن التحالف الوطني الصومالي في الولايات المتحدة عام 1993 لبناء نظام دعم يهدف إلى فتح المصالح الأمريكية والغربية في الصومال. وأيضا عمل على تنظيم مجتمع واشنطن المحلي لزيادة جهوده بغية تغيير السياسة الأمريكية في المنطقة الشرقية من أفريقيا. أوبي ايغبونا سبك الجبهة الأفريقية العالمية المناهضة للصهيونية لتقوية الروابط بين الأفارقة والفلسطينيين وفتح سياسة إسرائيل تجاه أفريقيا. كما نظم بلا كلل منظمة التحرير الأفريقية للعمل في زيمبابوي وكوبا ومنطقة البحر الكاريبي وآسيا وأمريكا اللاتينية. إضافة إلى عمله التنظيمي، جال في العالم متحدثا عن القضايا الأفريقية، وكرس حياته للنضال من أجل الحرية والمساواة للفقراء في جميع أنحاء العالم. يطيب لنا أن نستقبل المناضل الأممي أوبي ايغبونا، نتحدث معه من الداخل عن آخر أنشطته الميدانية في سياق رحلته للدفاع عن حقوق السود ولتبيان الحقائق المتعلقة بالنضال الأفريقي والإنساني والمقاومة واستخدام التاريخ أداة للتنظيم. أهلا بكم إلى حلقة جديدة من الداخل، معكم زينب صفار، تابعونا. Obi Egbuna Jr., Pan-African activist, playwright, and fighter for the cause of Black people, joining us from Washington, D.C. Welcome to Min al-Dakhil from the inside, Obi.
Thank you.
Pleasure to have you. Well, for more than 30 years, Obi, you have dedicated your life to engaging and organizing in African communities throughout the world. When we come to the notion of activism, you have a specific definition of activism or of being an activist. Tell us more, please.
Well, I'm more into the word activism can be very misleading. So I just say organizer. Organized formations that function for the purpose of having sustained organized activity for the collective advancement of our people and fighting for the total liberation of our people. Activism can be very misleading, and that may focus on what an individual contributes to history. But as the great Frantz Fanon taught us a long time ago, to educate the masses of our people is to passionately and relentlessly teach them that everything depends on them. So we're into mass emphasis all the time.
Right. What you have learned from your late father, Obi Egbuna, as a writer, that there are two types of people, those who write about the people and those who write for the people. And that's the difference between analysis by observation and analysis by participation. And until we make our culture, particularly the Black culture, the colored culture, and the political expression synonymous, we will never have total freedom as a people. About and for, two prepositions that obviously define the whole course of struggle, Obi.
Well, we're talking about the pen as a weapon of resistance, and we have an illustrious history of doing just that. So we're talking about using the pen the way George Padmore used the pen. We're talking about using the pen the way J.A. Rogers used the pen, the way Edward Wilmot Blyden used the pen, the way Daisy Bates used the pen, the way Ida B. Wells used the pen, the way Mary Church Terrell used the pen, the way Mangalizo Sobukwe used the pen. The pen is a weapon in the struggle for the total liberation of our people. So when the pen is utilized in that manner, then we're in very good hands. The pen, the way Amy Ashwood Garvey and Amy Jacques Garvey used it, when they created the Negro World, which was the catalyst behind the Universal Negro Improvement Association African Communities League, being the largest mass organization we've ever had as a people. Mm-hmm. So the pen in the hand of a fighter for the purpose of intensifying the fight.
Right. Now, in the sense, the devastation of COVID-19 continues to wreak havoc with sickness and death in the U.S., although the virus has claimed victims across class, creed, and color. The most affected has been the Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. Amid the global pandemic, where many countries allowed Cuban assistance, Washington refuses to soften its position. Why? And why are the Cuban successes in this regard being ignored and censored in the U.S. Mainstream and corporate media?
Hatred, white supremacy, what they would like Cuba to be. A lot of people make the mistake and they look at Cuba in the context of the triumph of the revolution. We must remember that the United States wanted to annex Cuba. The first 7 presidents of the United States wanted to annex Cuba. So they wanted Cuba to be like Texas and California, which belonged to Mexico. They wanted Cuba to be like Puerto Rico. They wanted Cuba to be like the U.S. Virgin Islands, an extension of Yankee imperialist territory in their Yankee imperialist clutches. So the hatred emanates from that. And then, of course, the Spanish-American War was over Cuba. And we have seen that tradition time and time again, where colonialist forces fight each other over who are going to colonize the people who they're seeking to make their prey. So long before the revolution, this was the goal. And it just goes to show you how when things come full circle, the country that they hate more than any country in the Western Hemisphere is the leading face of the fight to eradicate the genocidal pandemic. And this country and the United States of America has become the corona capital of the entire world. So that's just the way the chips fall. There are other ramifications. They know it will push towards the ultimate goal of getting the blockade lifted on Cuba. This genocidal policy, this diplomatic terroristic policy, it will be lifted. But most importantly, we put it in the context of a continuation of one of our oldest fights. We have been fighting for US-born Africans have been fighting for quality health care since the late 1800s, when our ancestors started the National Medical Association because of the segregationist policies of the American Medical Association. That's 1896, overshadowed by the Plessy versus Ferguson case, but nevertheless that happened. A few years later, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois did a sociological study called The Physique and Health of the Negro American. And then Booker T. Washington had Negro Health Month. So when we take a look at quality health care for US-born Africans, it shouldn't be looked at in the context or the prism or the restricted paradigm of the never-ending lovers' quarrel between Democrats and Republicans. This is something we have nobly and courageously fought for. And because our comrades in Cuba, our extended blood in Cuba, our extended kith and kin in Cuba have made healthcare the cornerstone of their revolution. Sure. And the Henry Reeve Medical Brigade is going all over the world, not only to eradicate corona, their track record dealing with Ebola, their track record of eradicating blindness in conjunction with our sisters and brothers in Venezuela, it's established. And this is why we have the Get Out of Cuba Way campaign and movement, where we are demanding for Cuban medical personnel to be cleared to come to the United States and treat people with the corona pandemic, to be cleared to come to the United States and train medical personnel who are not used to functioning in the midst of a pandemic. And also they would work in conjunction with the National Medical Association, the Black Nurses Association, and others who know their track record and respect their track record. And also we would be calling for the Food and Drug Administration to give clearance to the 4 vaccinations that they have created. 2 out of their vaccination institute, the Finlay Institute. One is called Sovereign 1, the other one is called Sovereign 2, and the other one that, the other 2 that they've created, one is called Mambisa, named after a female combatant during the Spanish-American War, and another one called Abdallah after a Jose Marti poem. So we're demanding that those 4 vaccinations are cleared so that people can have access to them who are on the verge of death. Right. And we also are demanding that they be cleared to come here and do what they do everywhere else. Right.
We will talk about the issue of the vaccines later on. But Obi, in this context, you did an incredible, colossally appreciated salute to Cuba that featured artists from around the world. You demanded to get out of Cuba's way and let their doctors help treat COVID-19 in the US of A. How are your demands received so far, and how quintessential is it to rally artists all over the African world to show their love and appreciation for the Cuban people and their revolution, and above all, their humanitarian efforts?
Gratitude is the cornerstone of solidarity, so we're obligated to show that appreciation. So that was the first phase of it. We did the first concert in July of last year, where we had artists representing 8 African nations, 5 Caribbean nations, 14 US cities, and 4 countries that are part and parcel of the UK. And then we came back at the end of February and did another concert. So when you put both concerts together, cultural artistic tributes rather, then we have artists representing 10 African nations, 8 Caribbean nations, 5 European nations, and 17 US cities. And we're into the second phase of the project now. We're not only demanding for Cuban medical personnel in the form of the Henry Reeve Medical Brigade to be given clearance to function in the United States, but we're also calling for a resource pool to give support to the 4,000 medical personnel that Cuba has strategically positioned throughout our mother continent, the mother continent of Africa, so we can assist them with their work. And so our people can know they have an alternative to the United States Agency for International Development. They have an alternative to Doctors Without Borders. They have an alternative to the Bush Foundation, the Clinton Foundation, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Right. Whose humanitarian aid represents political bribery, not the solidarity that is the genuine cornerstone of African-Cuban relations.
Sure. We were talking about the Get Out of Cuba's Way efforts, the work of Get Out of Cuba's Way movement, and the production of a mini documentary also coincides with a call by the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan of the Nation of Islam and to open America up for Cuban assistance. He cited America's record of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, giving the Native Americans blankets contaminated with smallpox and the polio vaccine that was contaminated with SV40 virus. The minister cautioned that any efforts of forced vaccinations would be a declaration of war. Well, that's very bleak, Obi. How can we explain this?
Well, this is light at the end of the tunnel. First of all, we thank the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam for doing a story on this Get Out of Cuba Way movement campaign. And we're very appreciative. And a 14-year-old member of the Nation of Islam, one of my students, Kaleem Muhammad, wrote an excellent article that was published in the San Francisco Bayview newspaper. So there's definitely a partnership. And we did an appeal last year for this demand. So we're not alone. And the reason we did an appeal instead of a petition, because we wanted to stick to the roots of our resistance. So we were following David Walker's appeal. We were following the appeal that the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey made to white America in 1923. We were following the appeal that Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois did in 1947, where Eleanor Roosevelt, while she was on the board of directors of the NAACP, fought him tooth and nail. We did it in the tradition of the appeal that Brother Malcolm was working on before the New York Police Department, FBI, and CIA had other ideas. So Mumia Abu-Jamal, who was fighting for his life, dealing with COVID right now and congenital heart failure, he's in support of the appeal. Russell Maroon Schultz, the illustrious freedom fighter, fighting for his life with stage 4 cancer and COVID, he supported our appeal. The daughter of Osagyefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, the Honorable Samia Nkrumah, who, as we know, Osagyefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah is the first head of state to acknowledge the triumph of the Cuban Revolution. The National Council of Churches, the most powerful religious/spiritual body in the United States, is in support of the appeal.
And we do support your appeal too.
Yes.
Sure, every free person should do that. It's a human rights issue.
So while we appreciate the most visible someone of the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan's stature being in support of this effort, there's a long list of supporters of dedicated fighters who understand Cuba's role, who understand Cuba's immeasurable value at this historical moment. I think that it's a question of context too. They've become the face of Corona at a moment in the world where Forbes magazine says there's 2,030 billionaires, but there's 784 million people living on $1.90 a day. And 400 million of them are in Mother Africa. They're doing it at a time where you look at the 46 countries that have least developed country status, 33 of them are on the African continent. And of the 25 poorest nations in the world, 22 are on the African continent. So like we said, we want to continue to support their work on the African continent. But the reason that is so critical to continue to pressure in the United States is because regardless of the history, 635 assassination attempts on the life of Fidel Castro, this monstrous blockade that has cost them nearly $200 billion since 1962 after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion of the Kennedy administration, the fact that they're still willing to come here, but the Democrats and Republicans keep accusing them of politicizing healthcare. But how can you say they're politicizing healthcare? That suggests that they only are willing to go to nations that are ideologically compatible with the principles of their revolution. If that was the case, they wouldn't have 54 doctors in Italy. If that was the case, they wouldn't be all over Latin America, where it's the worst nightmare of many of those governments that their people wake up one day calling for a socialist revolution that is a carbon copy of the Cuban Revolution. They are in those countries because of their human spirit. They are in those nations because of their conviction. So it is the United States that is politicizing the issue of healthcare when they continue to ignore them. Let us not forget they were willing to come after 9/11. Let us not forget after the Hurricane Katrina, they were willing to send 1,500 environmental disaster specialists to New Orleans. Let us not forget they wanted to come to DC General, where the poorest part of Washington, DC for a few years was without a level 1 trauma center or a prenatal care unit.
Right. Allow me here to ask you something. And excuse me if my question is going to be rather long. In Black Power in Britain, your late father, the legendary leader Obi Egbuna, and his colleagues wrote, quote, "We do not advocate violence, but we believe that the only way to neutralize violence is to oppose it with violence. We are no advocates of violence, but if a white man lays his hand on one of us, we will regard it as an open declaration of war on all of us." Today, in the prism of many violent, inhumane, deliberate actions against the Black community and the indigenous communities, of course, from, as you said, Hurricane Katrina to George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks, Ahmaud Arbery, and the actual killing of a Black man and woman every 12 hours across the US of A by extreme white supremacists with utter impunity, all the way to the coronavirus and the vaccine issues and how they approach that. Isn't that an open declaration of war, Obi?
When we say that we're against the blockade on Cuba, it's an emphatic statement that we want the United States to stop policing the world. We don't just want them to stop policing us in Ferguson, stop policing us in New York, stop policing us in Baltimore, stop policing us in Chicago. We want them to stop policing us in Zimbabwe and lift the sanctions on Zimbabwe. That's a form of policing. Stop policing us in Venezuela, lift the sanctions on Venezuela. That is a form of policing.
On Iran, on Syria, on Lebanon, all the countries
exactly.
The
list goes on and on.
Yes.
Remove the U.S. Africa Military Command from the African continent. Everything that they continue to do, but the diplomatic warfare in particular. So their job, as long as they function, and this is the most important thing though, when we say that we want to end police terrorism, we are asking the United States to cease to exist. When we are saying that we want them to change the healthcare system, we are asking them to cease to exist. These things are a staple of the political culture of the United States of America. So when we talk about what we're against, we also are obligated to talk about what we're fighting for. So we don't take knees to make Green Berets uncomfortable. We are against that culture of invasion, that culture of domination, that culture of rape, that culture of plunder. And that's what the blockade against Cuba represents, the sanctions on Zimbabwe represent,
True.
The sanctions on Venezuela represent, the sanctions that were on Eritrea for 10 years under a false claim that they were harboring al-Shabaab terrorists, as they call them, and what they're doing in these other places that you mentioned. And of course, when we talk about the blockade against Cuba, it's another reason to highlight and magnify why the Zionist state of Israel is the enemy of the African world. And everywhere Africans have progress, Israel comes to make things uncomfortable.
Right.
Just like when Algeria won their independence, they refused to acknowledge them as a sovereign nation. They did the same thing to Tunisia, and they supported apartheid in what's called South Africa, supported German colonialism in Namibia, and supported Portuguese colonialism in Mozambique and Angola, and supported British and Rhodesian colonialism in Zimbabwe. So the fact that the Zionist state of Israel is in favor of the blockade on Cuba, it's another reason to let Africans know how these Zionist Israelis feel about us. And it's not just about us giving the Palestinians our unwavering solidarity. It is their worst nightmare to see Africa redeemed as well.
Sure.
So all of the enemies of progress, all of the enemies of Africa are the enemies of Cuba as well.
Right. Africana peoples oscillate between variations of a peculiar aversion to history or wanting to know everything about history, specifically the African history. As a historical theater playwright for children, Obi, and as African history teacher for the last 31 years, how can African history be used as a tool for organizing today, especially organizing the youth?
Very simple. We just have to change the narrative. We have to go from a narrative rooted in victimization to a narrative rooted in resistance. We're going to leave the horror stories to Stephen King and M. Night Shyamalan. Every time we tell our story, it will be a story that shows our resolve, a story that shows our determination, and our story to maintain the path of organized resistance.
Right, Obi Egbuna, we salute you and thank you for your lucidity in writing, for being an electrifying speaker, and for firmly standing up for the people, not just with the people. Bless you and be safe.
Well, thank you very much.
Always a pleasure to have you, Obi. وشكر لكم مشاهدينا الكرام على طيب المتابعة. للتفاعل أكثر تابعونا على صفحات السوشيال ميديا، وحتى نلتقي من كل فريق عمل من الداخل من كل الميادين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.